Welcome here this morning. My name is Murray. I'm one of the pastors here at Grace Fellowship and grateful to be here. Lana's on my left, your right. We're reversed today in the other theater. So she's going to be interpreting for ASL for the deaf community. So thankful for her ministry here. And it's a good time. We're in chapter 5 already in our journey through 1 Timothy, this letter that has had so much to say to us as a church. And God's kingdom truth, we've learned one thing in going through this book, that sometimes it's going to butt up against us at various times. Because if you don't have a God who can't disagree with you, then really you have an idol. And that leaves really being you and your own reason as God. But if you really believe that you aren't God, and I really hope you don't believe that, but there's going to be some areas then that are going to challenge us. And hopefully we can all admit that there are some things that we don't have right, that maybe God's ways, his thoughts are actually above yours and mine. So in this passage today, God is going to instruct us how we're actually to relate to one another in the church of Jesus that's been formed by this gospel, formed for the gospel. And the church has different metaphors that God uses to refer to it throughout the New Testament. In some places, the church is called the bride of Christ, or as we heard at the conference, the babe of Christ. That sometimes referred to as the body. But probably the most common is actually family, a household. And that's because God himself in his person is family, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so when referring to Jesus followers in the New Testament, the most common word that the New Testament uses is adelphos. And adelphos is translated in some old translations, translated brethren. Some will translate it brothers, some will translate it brothers and sisters. And so that's what it really means. It means brothers and sisters. It means a family member. And it's used over 350 times. I can't remember the exact number. It's like 367 or 360 some times that adelphos is used in reference to the followers of Jesus. And contrast that with about 250 times the word disciple is used. And 3 times Christian is used. So you can see the heavy emphasis on brothers and sisters, a member of the family, when referring to followers of Jesus. So Jesus came to earth. He came to earth to conquer sin so that we could actually be reconnected to God as our Father, and then to be part of that family of God, and then be reconnected with one another as adelphos, as members of the family who love each other. And yet, for many people, it's real easy to just walk into a corporate service on a Sunday, sing a few songs, listen to a sermon, and then walk right out the door without any meaningful interaction with fellow believers. And this passage is not only going to challenge that, it's actually going to rebuke it. Because as the church, we're actually to love one another as family. So here's our scripture. We're in 1 Timothy chapter 5, and so we're going to cover the first 16 verses. If you don't have a Bible, there's still a couple left on the table. You can just take one of those Bibles to be able to follow along with us as well. And if you don't own a Bible, please take that Bible then home with you. It's our gift to you, and you can read this entire letter written to 1 Timothy. So it's towards the end of your Bible, 1 Timothy, then chapter 5.
Reading from 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 1 to 16. Do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, in all purity. Honor widows who are truly widows. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even when she lives. Command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. For some have already strayed after Satan. If any unbelieving woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows.
Paul has written this letter for the churches to a young co-laborer named Timothy, who actually came to faith really through the preaching of Paul. And to Timothy, Paul was like a father. And at the beginning of the letter, in fact, that's what he refers to Timothy, he says, my true child in the faith. And so this passage is going to help us to see how we're to relate to one another as the family of God. And we're going to see that contrary to popular belief, Jesus does not teach us to treat everyone the same. Starting with verse 1. Do not rebuke an older man. Let's just pause there for a moment. I want you to think about that one. Meditate on it. Do not rebuke an older man, okay? Because we want to be not just hearers of the word, right? But doers of the word. So do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him, right? As you would a father, and younger men as brothers. So here's Timothy. He's around 30 years of age. He's trying to get a lot of things straight in the church at Ephesus, which means he's going to have to do some correcting. He's going to have to do some admonishing, even admonishing some old men. And he's going to have to correct and exhort and relate to the women as well in the church to help really structure them together, young and old, men and women, as family. And so a lot of divide can happen between young and old. So Paul tells Timothy to give the older guys a level of respect. So don't just rebuke an older man like an equal. Don't go off on him like an Old Testament prophet, but encourage him really from this posture of humility, right? Like a son. And then older people, men and women, are not supposed to despise the younger, right? And then the younger can be frustrated by the older. And so you have a lot of problems in the church sometimes just with this age diversity. And Paul is going to say you need each other. God invented old men in order that you young people, among other things, could learn some patience and long-suffering. And remember, he's given the charge back in chapter 4 to the older to not despise the younger, right? Don't despise the younger because they can bring leadership and insight and vision and direction to the church. So he told the older back there, he says, so don't lose the next generation just for the sake of holding on to your old traditions, being cranky, and then writing off the young as if they're just idealistic dreamers. And then you younger, he says, don't get frustrated and write off the old as outdated, old school, irrelevant, and out of touch. So Timothy, he's saying, you need to learn from them, right? You need their wisdom from the experiences that they have had. So if you do need to speak words to them, he says, make it an encouragement. In other words, approach and relate to an older man as you would a father. So speak into their life, but there's a way that you'll do it. There's a tone that you will use and a posture of honor and respect. And then secondly, Timothy is to treat the younger men as brothers. right? Now, not like you treated your brother, okay? He's not telling Timothy to give the younger guys wedgies, okay? He's actually talking about the way you should have treated your brother, okay? The way Jesus treated his younger brothers. And that was with great encouragement and being an example. And then he says in verse 2, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters in all purity. So the older women then are to be treated and related to as mothers. And that's very countercultural because we live in a culture that seems to place a lot of value really on youth and beauty. And Paul says, I want you to treat the older women as your mom with honor and respect. So guys, that means when a woman older than you walks here into the theater, you should greet her, right? If she's carrying a load, you should offer to carry it for her. Maybe it's a great big study Bible, whatever it is, okay? But you should check in with her to see how she's making out, like you would your mom. And so how's she making out? You want to care for her like a mom. And then you want to listen to your mom when she gives you some wise counsel. You see, we need older men, we need older women to be the spiritual mom and dad that you need. And so we want to learn from their experience. You want to hear their story, take them out for a meal. They might even pick up the tab, but the church needs to be multi-generational. And that's why we don't do a lot of age-segregated ministry at this church. Right? So in our church, we actually encourage you to have friends that are much older than you, friends that are much younger than you. We want men and women together because together we display something of the glory of God and the gospel in this. He says, treat younger women as sisters. So here he's telling this young single guy how to treat younger women in the church as sisters with God's purity. And that's the way that relationships should be between the men and the women in the church. So, men, you should not treat the women here as equals. No, you should treat them much better than that, right? Much better than that. You're to treat them as mothers and sisters. And for those of you who are older, we are to treat then the younger women like daughters and the younger men as like sons. That's the relationships we're to have because the church is a family. And so your relationships, so for young men, he's making sure that your relationships then with younger women is like a brother-sister relationship, right? You're friends. You know and enjoy each other. And if at times that would blossom sometimes, like in Rom and Grace, if that blossoms into romance and marriage, then praise be to God. Now, I need to ask those of you who are married, or maybe you're in a relationship leading to marriage, would you please not wreck the culture that Jesus is calling us to be? A single guy should be able to talk to a single woman like a brother and sister and not have people trying to move them up the aisle. You know what I'm talking about? That's their sister. So they can and should encourage one another as friends in the gospel, brother and sister. They should be able to go for coffee. They should be able to hang out in community with a group of friends because we're family. And so a single guy should be able to talk to a married woman, a married guy to a single woman, as a sister, as a mother if she's older, right? You talk about the gospel and encourage one another. So let's not make this awkward for one another when we're supposed to be family. So let's help our single brothers and sisters actually redeem the time and actually point them to Jesus, not trying to set them up as if being single is a curse. See, there are no Christian yentas in the Bible. They're not there, right? Now, for some of our singles, it's enough of a fight just to be contented in their singleness. They fight for that. They fight to get in a place where they can be just contented being single, and then they can use the advantages that they have of being single for the kingdom. And then you've got somebody else trying to set them up as if they're incomplete. And then they wonder, what's wrong with them? What's wrong with me? I don't have anybody. They finally got themselves content, and you want to open up that wound, right? They are not incomplete. They have Jesus, and they have us as their family. And while I'm on a roll, don't be teasing or asking married couples when they're going to have a baby. Because maybe they're trying without success, and that little tease that you think is so funny, and they have to smile because they're Canadian and they're polite and they're family. But maybe they're trying without success. Maybe they did have a baby but had a miscarriage. And now where's your teasing going? And it's just ripping off this painful emotional scab despite the smile they may have on the outside. So can I say this as a member of the family to my father and brothers and mothers and sisters? Please, let's stop that kind of foolish teasing in the church, where we're not actually encouraging our brothers and sisters, we're actually wounding them. So how about talking about Jesus to them? Okay, I feel better. Now, Paul gives a case study regarding widows who are part of the family. So verse 3, he says, honor widows who are truly widows. So as the church, we care for those who have no family because we are family. Now, the word honor, which is a word that includes monetary help, it's for those in great need, and we get our word honorarium, right? So the word honorarium is really a parallel to this word honor. And so it is then for those who are truly widows. In other words, those who have no other means of support. So these are godly women who are truly they're left alone. But this is much more than just handing them a check, this word honor. It's actually caring for them as family. Because that woman who has either lost her husband and family through death, or she may have been, particularly in that day, divorced and cast off, forsaken, and abandoned. So in that culture, in a time and place where there were very few opportunities for women and there was no social assistance, this could be a desperate situation for a widow. And if you had no other family and your husband died, you could be destitute. And even many that were termed orphans, you read in the Bible as well, so could be a woman who's widowed with children, and they were termed then orphans because they no longer had that means of support as well. And so this was an issue in the church then, that's family. If we go back to Acts chapter 6, we see that it was in that place where the church was dealing with widows, and it was trying to care for them. But the non-Jewish widows were being neglected. They weren't being provided for. And they had no other place to turn, no other place to go. And so what the church did, it appointed these special servants, which we then came to know as deacons or special servants, to make sure that these Hellenists, these Greek widows were actually cared for. And then what was really cool is what happened is that this expression of family love actually led to more and more people coming to know Jesus because they were caring now for all those widows. In James 1, it talks about caring for widows and orphans that actually shows your faith is genuine. Now that's genuine religion, he says. And then throughout the Old Testament, places like Isaiah 1, different places in the Old Testament, God always called his people to plead the widow's cause, to care for widows and the fatherless. It's a common thread throughout the scriptures. In fact, one Old Testament story, just this beautiful story of, it's called the Book of Ruth, and it's really focusing first on Naomi. And Naomi is widowed. Her husband dies. She does have 2 grown sons who are also married, but within time, the sons die as well. And so her 2 daughter-in-laws are also then widowed. And Ruth, who's one of the daughters-in-law, now a younger widow herself, she actually moves back to Bethlehem with her mother-in-law, and she provides for her by gleaning, taking the edges, the leftovers, laying in the crops from after the harvest. So she would be gleaning to provide for her mother-in-law. And this beautiful love of Ruth, this younger widow caring for her older widowed mother-in-law, and it's just noticed and praised by the people of Bethlehem. And so news gets around. People were noticing just how this hardworking widow for her older widowed mother-in-law, and especially caught the eye of one guy named Boaz, too. And so the Bible has a lot to say about widows and the care. Jesus himself interacted with many widows. You might remember he noticed and praised a widow who gave 2 pennies to give to the poor. All that she had, right? That's a widow who would make this list that Paul's talking about in the church of Ephesus, right? And Jesus rebuked the religious leaders who were not looking after and caring for their parents because they use the term Corban. Our money is Corban. I've dedicated it to God, so I can't be using it to help my elderly, aging parents despite their need at all. So he rebuked that. And there was another case I remember where he was, when there was a widow's only son had died, and Jesus came to the funeral. Man, you love to invite Jesus to a funeral. And so he ended up raising the widow's son, her only son, and presenting her back. Now that's caring for a widow. But he had, the widows were in his heart, right? Those who were the outcasts, the broken, that's who he loved. Now, we live in a culture, our culture here, it's a different situation than it was there or what it is to some places in the world, but it still has application for us as individuals within the church family when individuals are in serious or sort of dire straits. So what's our role as the church? And this is what Paul gets to next in verse 4. He says, "But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God." So Paul's first instruction, he says, if there's a widow in your midst and she has kids or grandkids, family members or relatives, they should take care of her. So if you have a parent or grandparent in need, you should take care of them, right? This is pleasing in the sight of God, he says, right? And he says to make some return. In other words, to help them out. They gave so much to you, so now you have the opportunity to return that sacrificial love back to them. So they shouldn't come under the umbrella of the church if there are relatives there to care for them. So don't make the church pay for something that you should be paying for. And right at the end of the chapter, the very last verse of this section that we have in verse 16, he says, if any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. So therefore, and this is going to be troubling maybe to some of you, there are times that the church is directed by the scriptures to say no to those in need, in order for the church to be able to actually help those who are truly in need. So he gives these qualifications. Verse 5. She who is truly a widow, now he defines that, left all alone, first of all, right? No other source, no other family members, no other source of help, left all alone. And then secondly, she who is really truly a widow is one who has set her hope on God. And number 3, she continues in supplications and prayers night and day. There he says that's the qualifications of the one who's truly a widow, who we want to honor with monetary support as well as care. So we want to be a part, really, of God's answer to their prayer. We get to be part of the answer, which is pretty cool, I think. And it's showing them that their hope, which they've placed in the living God, is not misplaced. And part of their ministry then, in return, is ongoing prayer for the church family. And so you have this. And I just have to wonder how many people have come to faith in Jesus, how many lives have been transformed, how many churches have been richly blessed due to the continual prayers of faithful widows. See, for me, long before I was a pastor or church planter, that wasn't even in my thinking at that point, but there was Nellie Napier and Thelma Nedouin. Does anyone know Nellie Napier or Thelma Nedouin? I didn't think so. But the truth is, these were two older widows who lived in North Battleford when we lived in North Battleford. And these two older widows, there was some others as well, but these two in particular come to the forefront for me because they went the extra mile over and over again. They prayed for me and our family constantly. They continually encouraged me, and they actually pushed me towards pastoral ministry. And so, every blessing that Grace Fellowship has experienced has come on the foundation of their faithful prayers and their encouragement. So Grace Fellowship really is the fruit of their prayers. So get to remember their name. They're in heaven now, but faithful part of what's happening. And it continues on. The fruit of their prayers and labors continue on. In verse 6, here's the contrast, right? Well, they should do this first. Jesus also mentioned another. Before, when he first came, there's an 84-year-old widow named Anna that Luke brings up in Luke chapter 2. He highlights her devotion, right? Here's a true widow, picture of a true widow. Right? She didn't leave the temple complex. It says, serving God night and day in this faithful ministry of prayer and intercession. And she got to see then the birth of the Messiah before she died. And she is one held up, and she really becomes an example of that true widow. In contrast to what we see in verse 6 then, of our passage. He says, but, right? That's the contrast. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. So while she thinks she's living it up, Scripture says she's actually dead. She's dead. So she's dead spiritually. And that then what she did, he's saying we should not enable her, that self-indulgent one, to continue in that self-indulgence, that pattern of life, that living for pleasure right now in the here and now. She needs Jesus. See, there are people who just want to use Jesus and people who just want to use the church. The principle is this: if our help perpetuates a behavior that's ungodly, then we shouldn't. So this is a call for the church. This is a call for us for wisdom, for discernment. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, it's an interesting passage. There, people were so expectant that Jesus was going to return very soon that they quit their jobs, and some of them even were sitting out camping on the hillside so they'd be a little closer waiting for him to return. And so after a little time, Jesus didn't return. After a while, they were getting a little hungry. But they had left their jobs, and so those who had left their jobs are starting to think, well, the church, you should take care of us, right? You should support us. And Paul says, you aren't getting food here. He says, you're not getting food here. You're not getting food from us. They don't work. Don't give them anything to eat. Because if all your help is just perpetuating this self-indulgent behavior, it's not paving the way to Jesus. He says, don't help people avoid the pain, which actually is a great teacher. So Paul said, even though he's an apostle and a pastor, and as such he had the right to be supported, yet he says in that same passage, I work to support myself so as not to burden the church. So the church's funds could then go to the greatest need to advance the gospel. Now you say, well, that's not loving. But God, who seems to know a thing or two about love, oh yeah, he is love. he says that is the most loving. That is the most loving. If you know the story of the prodigal son, it's in Luke chapter 15, where the son took his father's inheritance, wishing his father dead, took that away, and he squandered everything in prodigal living. And at the end, in Luke 15, the end of verse 16, we read this, and no one gave him anything. No one gave him anything. And thus, it was his pain and suffering that actually led him home. Led him home. But if people had kept funding his self-indulgent prodigal living, he wouldn't have needed to come home. And he would have died out there, living for the moment, partying his way all the way to death and hell. And he would not have experienced the glorious reception of his gracious Father. And that's why I would encourage you, don't give money to people in apparent need unless you actually know them in their life and the reason for that need. Those guys that stand on the side of the road and take your money to go feed their habit, that's not biblical help for the poor. That's contribution to sin and folly. And God says, don't do it. Don't perpetuate destructive behavior. So it's a call for wisdom and real love, which can really be tough to do in some situations, right? But their real need is a relationship with Jesus. So we always need to be asking for wisdom. We need to be able to discern, is my help actually perpetuating a behavior of ungodliness? There is a great book, it's called When Helping Hurts, and that addresses this whole idea, I think, quite well. But we need to be wise, right? And this is what Paul is getting at. The church needs to be wise and not naive. See, the church has this reputation of being very naive, very gullible. You just have to ask anybody on the streets. We're often manipulated. We are motivated by guilt as opposed to being led by the Spirit through the Scriptures. And so we need wisdom, we need discernment so that what we do in the name of love is really love. In verse 7, he then says, command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Worse than an unbeliever. But he says, even unbelievers take care of their parents and relatives. So to reject this, to not love the members of your household is to deny the faith, right? And the church too is a family. So we, having received the gracious gift and provision of Jesus, we want to joyfully care for those in our household. He says in verse 9, let a widow be enrolled if she's not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and that is a faithful wife if she was married, and having a reputation for good works, if she's brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. So in verse 9, it seems to be speaking of an enrollment of some sorts, which seems to be, to me, long-term support. So there's this list, there's this enrollment that they would have of particular older widows, and they were then supported on a long-term basis by the church. And really, they're supported to serve the church. You see characteristics, much like if you're going to appoint an elder or appoint a deacon, if you're going to appoint a widow to this role who's going to serve the church and come under long-term support, these are the characteristics you're looking for. So it's never just taking, right? It's always, you always see this receiving and taking. It's always give and take. So the widow is supported, but this widow just gives to the church in service and in prayers. You see that. And he says in verse 11, but refuse to enroll the younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry. So I think this is referring to, in particular, the long-term support in that regard. So, and obviously there's some single women can get to the point where they desire to be married so strongly that it actually leads them away from Jesus, who is the ultimate spouse, whose love alone can satisfy forever. And then he says in verse 12, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. And besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, because that's what you do not want to promote. You don't want to enable that. And not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have the younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander, for some have already strayed after Satan. So we don't want to be supporting a person to enable them to be idle. Boaz helped Ruth. And you'll notice as you read through the book of Ruth, you'll see, what did he notice? Well, he found out about her before he gave her any extra help. He found out about who she was, this woman from Moab, and what she had done for her mother-in-law. He began to see that she had turned from the idols of Moab to follow the true and living God of Israel. And so we see that. So he learned about that first of all. And then, once he verified her faithful character, her love of the God of Israel, he made sure she got extra grain. But if you've read the book of Ruth, you'll find out he didn't just hand it to her or deliver it to her door, enabling her to be idle. What did he do? Does anyone know? Yeah, he told his harvesters, just leave a little extra, right, where she's going to be, and make sure she's protected, right? Don't let any harm come to her. So he did that. But she's still out there doing the work, getting up early, doing all the work herself. He's not enabling her to be idle, but he is caring for her in a godly way and watching out for her. But she still had to do the work every day. This was not a handout. Now, Boaz let all the poor would glean from his field, as they would do in Israel. But this faithful widow, she got long-term support. She got a ring, right? She got long-term, but she in turn worked and served, and they together supported then Naomi as an older widow. So those in the family, all right, who have a real need, no other options, we want to help care for them. In most cases, we want it to be a short-term arrangement, really to help them get back on their feet. But if you request money from the church, it should be a real need. We don't want to use our money to simply fund a lifestyle or an experience or even an adventure. For example, if you want to experience the adventure of a short-term mission trip, which I think is great and a tremendous experience and can be incredibly helpful to your perspective and worldview, but ideally, you should work and save up. And you should save up and set aside money to fund yourself and not burden the church or others, because you want the money of others and the money of the church to actually fund where there's real absolute need, and to fund maybe the church recognized appointed people taking that gospel forward, right? Ones that God has called and set apart for his mission. So just providing for someone, allowing them to be idle, is not good. Idleness is a danger. It's a danger for both genders. Here it focused on the danger here for some of the women, but for men too. Too much idleness leads to lust and fantasy. Idleness for women often leads, according to the letter here, to gossip, being a busybody, being on Facebook, social media half the day. Because women by design are designed to talk and to connect. That's not a bad thing. There's a lot of words that need to be said, but gossip is destructive. And so neither men nor women should be idle. It leads down a wrong path. And so if the church meets all the younger widows' needs, it actually removes the urgency for them to have to do something to move forward. So for the younger widows, Paul says, get busy. Remarry a godly guy if given the opportunity. Have children, because there's not too many mums who have too much idle time. And best case scenario, that's to Paul. Almost he sees that as the best case scenario is for a woman to be at home discipling her kids. That's the most honorable place in the culture of God. Now, you might not be able to pull that off, but at least in the scripture, it's certainly held up as an ideal. Our culture does not hold up a stay-at-home mom in high esteem, but God holds that up as honorable and desirable. And inferred in this is for men to get a job, right? Get married, take care of your family, and be willing to marry a widow, to marry a single mom. Does marrying a single mom come with baggage? Yes. That's why only a godly man can qualify. And that's what Boaz did for the younger widow Ruth, and then together they worked to provide for the older widow Naomi, even presenting her grandchild, right? All of the line eventually to Jesus. Verse 16, he closes, if any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows, or those who are in true desperate need. And so when someone comes to the church with a need, a lot of questions need to be asked. Do they qualify? Right? So don't just throw the church's money away, because to give money in one place is to say no to another need. And we can't support every need. It's just not feasible, not possible. So we need to be very careful about actually who we give our money to, just as you do. And that's why we're very prayerful about who we support with our funds. Where is the greatest need for the greatest impact of the gospel? And that's why our focus is first and foremost on supporting churches being planted, because that's God's method of advancing his kingdom and transforming communities through local, visible churches. And so we like to support church planters who don't have access to a lot of other resources or other church help. This month, we were able to help Andrew Labinga. You don't know him any more than Nellie Napier. But I just spoke with him on Thursday. Who is Andrew Labinga? He is a young man moving in a pastoral pipeline from Uganda. And so he's our brother. And we're part of the family of God. And so we are paying his way to the Acts 29 conference in Malawi, so he can go there to be trained and equipped with the potential of down the road being assessed as a church planter in Uganda. And he is incredibly thankful. So, on his behalf, thank you, family. Thank you for allowing that to be, and we'll see what fruit comes out of that. But thank you for giving regularly so that we actually have the ability to distribute it for the kingdom. So thank you on his behalf again. So there is different situations when the church is not to step in a long-term way. So we're not to step in a long-term way, such as when widows actually have family and family members who can look after them, such as widows who are self-indulgent, and such as younger widows who actually have options. Now, they may need some immediate help, some help with bills to help them get on their feet, but I think this needs to be a short-term arrangement. But honor is not just monetary help. It's actually caring for one another as families. And especially those individuals who have no other local family other than the church family. They should receive special thought, attention, and care. Because it's the gospel that drives us. Because when we were orphans, Jesus provided for us a father. his Father. And Jesus provided for us a family, his family. And even though we were unfaithful, he was the one who washed our feet. He was the one who gave continual prayer and intercession for us. We were condemned, we had strayed after Satan, and yet Jesus paid that debt and exchanged his life of good works for ours, which weren't that good. He let us stand before God on the basis of his good works. We were destitute, beggarly poor, and didn't belong. And Jesus came to us. He moved to the cross to pursue us, and he brought us to his home, where he makes continual provision for us as our bridegroom. Jesus is delighted in us. He treasures us. He honors us. And in our abandonment, in our desperate need, he actually provides far above anything we could ever ask or think or imagine. And he didn't just cut a check to cover our entrance into heaven. He gave us himself. In love and sacrifice, he entered into a relationship with us, one of ongoing care and nourishment and belonging as a part of his family. So Lord, I just pray you would increase our love for you and for one another.